Well, welcome to our last show of April for Culturally Appropriate. I'm clearly your host, Jerod Hollyfield. We've got a great show lined up, and I'm extremely excited to bring on our first guest. So, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about Taylor Swift. So, if you want to hear two white men talk about Taylor Swift, this is the show for you today. We're going to be talking about the Tortured Poets Department, or this wonderful acronym that Geneva created for us. Next, I'm going to talk about the new movie Sasquatch Sunset, which I had a lot of fun with. And as always, we're going to have our weekly film rundown. This is an amazing, amazing week for new films opening up in the Nashville area. So I'm quite excited to talk about those as well. So let's go ahead and get started because we have a lot to get through today. So I'd like to introduce Mark Hemingway. You might remember Mark from our show right before Thanksgiving. He's the author of a viral piece about Taylor Swift being indicative of our cultural decline that pretty much dominated conversations last summer. And we had him on to talk because, I'm a tepid Swiftie, I would say, as much as it makes me cringe to say that. But I had a wonderful conversation with Mark back in November where we sort of talked about the particulars of Taylor Swift. And I think, Mark, we have pretty similar taste in music outside of Taylor from what I can glean. So, so I'm really excited to have you back on, as I said. And I guess the first question that I want to ask you is, you wrote this piece last summer. Taylor Swift wrote this massive, unwieldy 17-track album, and then an additional 14 tracks, I think 31 in all. So after listening to Tortured Poets Department, how do you feel this album stacks up with what you wrote last summer?
Well, it feels vindicating in a lot of ways. Although I want to be clear, even though I had issues with Taylor, they were, sort of narrowly tailored issues in the sense that my issue with Taylor is not that, there isn't a place for pop stars in, our world, or that Taylor Swift didn't write songs that were, catchy, or that I didn't understand why she was popular. It was just that Taylor reached this, level of cultural ascendancy last year with her tour that caused all these people, that otherwise wouldn't pay attention to her that much, like, the New Yorker and the New York Times and stuff, to just pile on all of these, praise that was just, totally unearned, as an artist. Like, Taylor Swift is what she is. She's a hard worker. She's very good at what she does, but she is not the second coming of Bob Dylan or Leonard Cohen. And that was, kind of what was like just driving me insane. Like why are we pretending that Taylor Swift is something that she's clearly not? And to that end, this latest record, the interesting thing about it to me is that it's really reaching. Like it's really her trying to expand her sort of like artistic sense of self and, do something that is much more adult and much more sophisticated and falling flat on her face. I mean, it really proves a lot of what I was trying to say. It's like, stick to the pop ditties, girl, and you're good at those. But there's, this attempt at lyrical sophistication that is just, it's interesting because there's a lot of, moments of self-awareness, and maybe I can get into that I think are kind of laudable. There's also just a lot of lyrics that are just, unbelievably cringeworthy. Like, how did no one, tell her not to do that? Like, the most vicious thing I saw said about the album, this tweet, was that this guy said that everyone who likes the new Taylor Swift album got their English assignments handed back to them face down, which, of course, prompted this just litany of Swifties posting their report cards in response to this tweet, which, I don't know, in a weird way kind of proved the point. But I think the critical consensus is there's a lot of people that are trying to find good things to say about it, but the critical consensus is erring on this, clearly on the side of bad, which is very unusual for Swift, especially after all the triumphal nonsense of last year.
Yeah. So the weird thing for me was, before I listened to the record, because I like Taylor Swift well enough. I'm not going to stay up until 5 a.m. listening to a new record the night it drops. But I read Rob Sheffield's review in Rolling Stone that came out like about 10 o'clock last Thursday night, where he called it like an instant masterpiece, which I was that really built up the hype for me, because that's a music critic that I really like. I loved his memoir. I loved a lot of the books that he's written as well. So I was going into it with that sort of level of anticipation. And I agree with you. I feel like the record doesn't work in the same way. It's probably, I would put it on par with Lover in terms of some of the lyrics being as cringeworthy. I mean, You Need to Calm Down is probably one of the worst Taylor Swift songs in terms of lyrics. And I think it's got some rivals on this record for sure. But something for me that I think made it even worse is that I spent most of March listening to Casey Musgraves' new album. And I don't know, have you heard Deeper Well yet?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just curious what you think about that record.
Um, I don't know. I have some issues with a lot of the sort of new country pop crossover stuff that's happening, generally speaking. Having, and I could, talk about that at length. But I think what I would say, though, is whatever you want to say about Casey Musgraves. I mean, my criticisms, again, I'll fall in these like weird sort of like cultural things. But when you get to the core actual album, like that's a talented musician doing high level work, at the end of the day. It is, quality songwriting, even if I, have my personal or, critical objections to it around the edges. You can't deny it is, someone who knows what they're doing, and it's a focused bit of work, which is kind of the exact opposite of what we're doing with Taylor Swift here.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like that album is so precise, and that's a record like my parents could listen to a song like Cardinal and really like that song. But it feels authentic in a way that I feel like Taylor Swift is sort of reaching for on this record. There's sort of this like Taylor persona that she's sort of in this position now where she's now trying to sort of reach this populist audience that she's gleaned, but she doesn't really know how to do it in some ways. Like, for instance, on the song Florida, like I don't know why Taylor Swift is mentioning a timeshare in Destin. I don't think that that's something, maybe like back in the Christmas tree farm days, but that just kind of struck me as wrong in a lot of ways. And I do like that song, but the album seems marked for me in a lot of those ways. But something else that I wanted to ask you about is, the album is very repetitive. And I think we have a couple of your tweets that Geneva's going to pull up. This album to me feels like, and I'm looking here, good grief, only 25 more songs to get to, and there's no songs. Even though I'm not really a fan, Swift is notably hooky and catchy. This is all in my favorite, overproduced, mid-tempo vibes. I feel like this album doesn't have a distinct identity. It sort of seems like a B-sides to Midnights. And I do think in 10 years, if we're looking back at this album in a way that we might be looking at like Garth Brooks's Chris Gaines days back in the late 90s, I feel like in some ways there's not a more perfect soundtrack to this sort of weird Biden era of cultural attrition we're in than this record. Not to say that it's great, but it seems to me like it's an album about being stuck in this moment and like sort of unable to get out. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that reading of the record.
Yeah, stuck and unable to get out is kind of a weirdly meta commentary on the problem with the album. In that, again, there's no songs here. Like, there's no big choruses, there's no big hooks. Everything is just plotting and mid tempo. And even the best songs in the album, like Fortnight and I Can Do It With a Broken Heart, are really, they feel like the, sort of cathartic song that would be on the back end of an otherwise good album that, wouldn't necessarily be a hit, but it would be kind of a fan favorite, kind of thing. Because it was, way too moody, and, to be on the radio. But, was otherwise had some things going for it. And those are the best songs on the record, and I just don't understand, what was going on there, other than it was just sort of like complete freedom and complete self-indulgence. Taylor Swift has always been like very notably proud of the fact that she writes all of her own songs. I've never quite believed that, frankly, given the fact that there's all kinds of lawsuits with Uber producer Max Martin and things like that, who sort of claim otherwise. But, if this is, Taylor Swift, unchained and, Jack Antonoff just running off and doing whatever the hell she says, then, it doesn't really speak to sort of the quality of the album. I mean, she's doesn't really have ideas. She's just kind of emoting, and they're trying to find some sort of like synth pad underneath that vaguely matches a lyrical idea. And there's no strong melodies, there's no hooks, and there's importantly no big choruses really. They're interesting musical ideas, and it's very well produced in a lot of ways, but it's just not. There's no there.
I don't feel like there's a single either. I mean, I know there are singles on the record, but I've got my tote bag for the summer that says "It's me, I'm the problem, it's me" on it, and I don't feel like there's anything reaching that level of resonance on the record. But something that did really surprise me about it, I was kind of expecting with this record, especially coming out in an election year, and Taylor being so vocal, which is one of the kind of ironies that I talked about in my piece that I wrote about her last fall, where, you know, she's sort of this artist that's like built on the back and built on the fruits of conservative politics of a suburb like Hendersonville, but she has this sort of, you know, Nashville political ideology, in terms of, you know, her role in the region where the pamphleteer is located. But I was looking at the track list. I saw a song called Florida. I was just like, oh shit, here we go. We're gonna get like another level of you know, Shade never made anybody less gay kind of lyrics here. But I was shocked, at least by the main album, how apolitical it was. That was kind of a surprise for me when I was listening to it. Like, I don't know how an artist or what an artist would do. I mean, you have a song called Florida in the Ron DeSantis era, and it almost goes out of its way to not be a political song. I mean, and I've seen these random interpretations that it's about her breakup with Joe Alwyn, or is it about Joe Jonas's breakup with his wife, you know, all of these sorts of things. But why do you think this album is so apolitical, given that's kind of been what Taylor Swift has been known as? And really, when the media started paying attention to her is whenever she sort of first started dropping her anti-Marsha Blackburn, anti-Trump tweets and social media posts. But like, why kind of what I perceive as a pullback here from that political agenda that she's sort of been keeping up over the last 7-8 years?
Well, to be clear, you know, I don't want to speculate about artistic motivations. Having said that, having said that, I don't know what's in Taylor's head. You know, I think it goes back to this issue of, you know, vibes, you know, in the moment where we're in. I mean, the vibe during the Trump years was very sort of crazy and angry and all this other stuff. I mean, I would argue there wasn't really a lot of basis for a lot of that, you know, anger and craziness, but it was what it was, and so it was understandable to, you know, see people reflecting the mood of the country and stepping out in that way. Right now, though, I mean, I just saw a chart this morning. Joe Biden is at this point in his presidency, like significantly the most unpopular president since the end of World War II. Right? You know, he's even like 6 points below where Trump was at this point in his presidency, and Trump never got above 50% approval, I think, his entire presidency, really. So, I mean, this is a truly epically disastrous political environment if you're, you know, leaning left and you're someone who's trying to appeal to a broad audience, and you have to be sort of honest about that. You know, I don't think that Taylor necessarily chose, you know, not to be political so much as she's just like reflecting the zeitgeist in that regard. You know, it just doesn't feel like a time to like be speaking up, you know, in defense of a guy that's deeply unpopular, and you know, objectively speaking, things are not good in the country economically and otherwise, and things feel very uncertain and unstable. So your best bet, if you do lean to the left and want to cater to a broad audience, is to just sidestep the issue altogether, without, you know, trying to offend anyone. You know, but part of it also is, I think, just, you know, she was very consciously trying to make a statement about her maturity with this record. And I think that, you know, politics would have gotten in the way of that, because politics is just, you know, especially in a rock and roll pop music context, is frequently just, you know, splenetic, or, you know, some venting of the id.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that Onion article from like 2004, which is like talking about all the pop stars endorsing John Kerry, and it's like the fake quote from John Mellencamp: "If I can play Jack and Diane in a political way, then I've done my part in this world," kind of situation. But you know, the other thing too that happened this week that I feel like didn't get enough attention is that Mark Hamill released that tweet about Joe Biden being this amazing president. And I mean, I think the way that he got ratioed on that tweet deserves a new term for being ratio. Just, he became sort of a laughing stock, and it wasn't even from like the usual suspects either. It was just kind of, I think, otherwise apolitical accounts just mocking him relentlessly for this. And you know, I do wonder if Taylor Swift had come out with sort of this protest record at this point, if that might not have been a little bit seeing some of the fraying from the era, so to speak.
Yeah. No, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I want to be clear here. I mean, like, I get why people don't like Trump, but at this point in time, frankly, I have a lot of sympathy for just sort of ordinary Democrats. You know, I think that, you know, a lot of, you know, people that have been typically thought of themselves as liberal or Democrats are looking around right now and realizing that things are not going well. I think they're also in a situation here where a lot of Republicans feel where their leaders are ideological in a way that doesn't necessarily represent any sort of like centrist sentiment more where they might be. And certainly if you look at what's going on right now with the Palestine stuff on college campuses and things like that, there's a lot of people that feel like there's a lot of radicalism that has been uncorked, and the Democratic Party has some sort of role in letting that happen, and doesn't know how to get the genie back in the bottle. And then on top of that, like if you're hoping that you have some sort of political leaders that can put a cork on things, you're dealing with a guy that is literally non-compos mentis at the head of the party right now. I mean, it's crazy. So I wouldn't want to make this a thing about politics either.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a weird world when someone like Bill Ackman like actively admits to voting for Trump in 2016 on X. Like I was shocked whenever that happened last night.
Yeah.
And this is kind of, I guess, the world that this record is in. Something else that I really wanted to talk about with this record and sort of the vibe that it gives off. This is the first record I feel like Taylor Swift is not making a Taylor Swift record in some ways. There's an irony because the lyrics are confessional and it is clearly about, some very specific moments in Taylor Swift's life. But I almost feel like this is Taylor Swift doing what Ryan Adams did to 1989, where I feel like this is almost a tribute album to Lana Del Rey or The National or Beach House, as opposed to like a Taylor Swift sound.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very interesting and astute observation. Now, what I would say is one of the criticisms I had for Taylor Swift for a long time was that she was so friggin' one-dimensional. It's like, okay, here's another 1-5-6-4 chord change, and here we go. This is going to be in a pop tune. The chorus is going to come in 30 seconds in. It was very predictable in a formulaic way, and this is not that. And I give her credit for, in some respects, for trying to branch out. And I think to some extent there's a lot of self-awareness on the record about the degree to which she's branching out. So, like, for instance, I believe it's Guilty of Sin. The opening lines of the song, she name checks the Blue Nile, which kind of shocked me. Are you familiar with the Blue Nile? They're kind of a cult band from the 80s. And they fall into sort of a genre that I guess you'd call like sophistopop. But they think of like a, I don't know, a sort of a new wave synth drenched version of, say, Leonard Cohen. Like it's this very sort of like interesting, moody, contemplative music. And in some respects, it's very much a model for what Taylor Swift was trying to do here. And I would encourage everyone to go back to listen to the Blue Nile's, first two records, Walk Across Rooftops and Hats, and see that. And it's really interesting to me that like she's like that self-aware in some regards of her trying to like spread her wings. It's just sort of disappointing to me that I believe she's an enormously talented person, to be clear. And I think she's highly intelligent. But it's also true that she's a pop star that's grown up in a cocoon, and I just don't know if she's been able to like develop enough normally and intellectually or whatever to pull off that sort of artistic shift, and especially this far into her career. I mean, I do think it's interesting that, like, for instance, even a guy like Prince, who seems like he's coming from Neptune, half the time, was writing hit songs about working at the Five and Dime and things like that. There's this sort of attempt to like stay grounded and relatable through much of his career. And he's sort of seemingly conscious of that, like what it was like to be a young kid with a summer job and things like that. Whereas Taylor Swift never really experienced any of that. She was so famous at an early age. Although Prince was famous at fairly age too, but it at least seemed like he, I don't know, maybe he was growing up African American or what. He seemed to, have some more grounding. And I think that that's exactly what she needs. It's great that she's name checking Dylan Thomas, although she probably first heard him because of the Phoebe Bridgers song. And it's great that, she's mentioning Aristotle, although I don't think she's going to be giving us any lectures on the Nicomachean ethics anytime soon. But she just needs to put a lot more substance on the bones to pull off a record like this.
So I had the chance last night to see this new Amy Winehouse biopic that's coming out in a couple of weeks. I'll be reviewing it. And I was just struck I had forgotten how amazing of a vocalist Amy Winehouse was, but also exactly to your point that Amy Winehouse really did take off some time. I mean, probably not the most healthy choice, but she took off time between Frank, her first record, and Back to Black, and really sort of experienced life in kind of the same way that you're talking about. And, you know, I feel like in some ways, Amy Winehouse was kind of doing what Taylor Swift is known for at that particular point. So, you know, that record has a lot of life on it that I feel like is missing. I went back last night and listened to Back to Black for like the first time in a long time. And, you know, like I really feel like that's sort of the album. But what also really struck me about that difference is, and this comes up, I think, in Florida too, that, you know, I've never really thought of Taylor Swift as like a bad singer. I mean, I've always liked her voice, but in the song Florida, like Florence and the Machine just utterly obliterates her. I mean, that track just, I mean, I don't want to say it's an embarrassing track because I do love the song, but it's such a sense of cognitive dissonance listening to that song or listening to someone like Amy Winehouse. So I feel like on this album, we're really getting a lot of the limits of what Taylor Swift can do, both in terms of her lived experience, which I know I hate using that term,
Right.
but also in terms of her vocal quality. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is really interesting. You bring up the Florence and Machine comparison because if you've ever seen Florence and Machine live, I mean, that woman is otherworldly. I mean, talk about a stage presence. I mean, she's incredible. In addition to her actual vocal talent, and she just like sucks the oxygen out of the room when she walks on stage. And like, it's pretty obvious to me that one, I laud Taylor's for seeking out an artist of that caliber and collaborating with her. Although I don't know, I also have some mixed feelings about, say, like the guys from the National trying to launder Taylor's pop music, career into respectability. I have mixed feelings about that. But it's also true that the comparison doesn't serve her well. Like she's enormously talented in so many ways, as a pop musician and a businessman and as someone who caters to her fans and all this other stuff. But she's just at the end of the day, there's this famous story in the history of Saturday Night Live where apparently Chevy Chase and Bill Murray hated each other's guts. And right before they got in this big fight, and right before they were to go on stage, Bill Murray yelled at Chevy Chase, "Medium talent." And I feel like that is about the most devastating thing that you could utter. It's like, yeah, she's talented. You can't deny it. But like, again, listening to this album, the problem is you're hearing her on about every level, lyrically, musically, vocally, bumping up against her limits. And there's a hard ceiling. Again, I think she's really intelligent enough that maybe one day she could reinvent herself, and do something really, much broader in scope artistically that'd be well received. But I think about this, Courtney Love, God bless her. I can't remember a while back, she called Lana Del Rey a genius, but then said that she should take 7 years off. And I feel like that would be a recipe for Taylor Swift, if that were possible in her weird, billionaire cocoon lifestyle anymore, to like, go out and, I don't know, swim with the whale sharks or whatever the hell she needs to do to like have some sort of like genuine life experience that is relatable and she can bring to things. Like, it's just like fascinating to me when you think about like artists like Bruce Springsteen or Tom Petty or whatever, and like how amazingly distilled their lyrics are at their best in terms of like just grounded in these like ordinary things that people in their ordinary lives feel. And the fact that those guys could carry on very long careers. Well, I feel like Bruce Springsteen has kind of lost the plot some years ago, but carried on long career for decades. And Tom Petty never lost that touch of being able to like speak to a voice that speaks to ordinary people. And some level Swift, like she speaks to this narrow range of teenage emotion. And part of the problem we're having here is there's this contrast between her yearning for this adult sophistication, but having these like artistic imperatives that she speaks to sort of teenage angst at the same time. And the contrast just doesn't work. And she's got to find a way out of that box.
Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, for me anyway, what first drew me to Taylor Swift was that I was teaching at the time whenever she was sort of rising to fame during the like eponymous album debut and then Speak Now and Fearless, where, I was teaching a course in like adolescent literature and culture. And she worked so perfectly in that course because I feel like she was much more universal than in her country days. And what's been frustrating for me about Swift is like, I would love her to make a Casey Musgraves record. And I feel like, she's had that hard break with country, but in a lot of ways, she's also sort of lost a lot of what made her a special artist in doing that, sort of, trading up that level of, not just adult sophistication, but political sophistication as well.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. That's a really interesting idea. And I think that would be a good way for her to approach it. Would be, go back to country. Hell, Beyonce is going country. Although there's a weird thing about this that no one's really discussing. It's kind of fascinating. Actually, Rick Beato, praise be upon him, did a recent video about this where, and I can't believe more people aren't talking about this, about how like R&B and hip hop especially, and pop to some extent, are kind of like down in the Hot 100, and rock is somewhat ascended. The country's way up, and so to some extent, Beyonce's move to go country isn't like, I think is kind of a cynical move to stay sort of culturally relevant, because the typical stuff that she does isn't just doing as well on the charts. But I don't know. I have a good friend that's a Nashville singer songwriter, and as is his wife, and they're constantly complaining to me, because they're old school about how there's a certain degree of authenticity that is even being lost in Nashville these days. From the days when people like Merle Haggard and Willie Nelson were first generation influences, as opposed to being filtered through several other things. But I don't know. I mean, country is still, whatever problems it's got these days, is still inherently more sincere. And I think Taylor Swift would benefit from trying to do something that was just flat out more sincere and less artifice involved.
Yeah, and I mean that was, I think, one of the great things about Lenny Wilson dominating the CMAs. I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways she's a lot more authentic artist than, especially someone like Maren Morris, who I think is kind of the dregs of country. But Casey Musgraves or Taylor. Sorry,
I cannot stand Maren Morris, and not only that, she's so full of herself too. Speaking of medium talent, oh my gosh. Yeah, I don't know, but like Zach Bryan, for instance, I mean, like, he's authentic. Give him that. There's not a lot of artifice behind what he's doing. It's not overproduced, and there's a guy in a room writing songs. So there's still room for that in country, thank God. And there isn't a lot of room for that in many sort of genres these days, with the way the music industry is just imploded.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about, because I've been thinking about this line from the Taylor Swift album in the song "Tortured Poets Department," where she says, "You're not Dylan Thomas, I'm not Patti Smith." And it's kind of a two-part question, but the first part of that is like, I mean, do you think that, in some ways she is admitting her limitations very early on in this record, or, how do you read that line?
Well, I think I said something like that on Twitter at the time. It's got that there are moments of admirable sort of self-awareness, although it's kind of funny because I think the next line is, it's like, "I'm not Dylan Thomas, you're not Patti Smith, this ain't the Chelsea Hotel," I think is the next line. And a friend of mine pointed out that like the Chelsea Hotel has been like completely renovated, it's like dramatically upscale these days, which is sort of captures the sort of bitter irony of a lot of the failures here. Yeah, like I said, I do think that's admirable. Like, what she's trying to do is extremely admirable. And like, I hear this, and I don't want people to think that, like, because I think this album is a failure and a bad album, frankly. I don't want her to take from this, if she were to hear this, that she shouldn't try this and she should just go back to writing 3.5 minute, pop ditties. I really would like to see someone of her capability, if resources, if nothing else. She can record forever and not have to worry about money. Really try and rethink what she could do as an artist. I mean, there's certainly precedent for this. I mean, I think Madonna did a lot of surprising things in her career and succeeded at them, and certainly, proved the doubters wrong in terms of her being able to do more sophisticated, interesting stuff than people previously thought she was capable of. And I don't think Madonna is, an especially talented, artist. She's not like a Florence and the Machine caliber, vocal artist or anything like that. I think she very much fits in the Taylor Swift mold in terms of being this sort of, overachieving medium talent. So my hope is that she can, I don't know, learn from whatever, crash and burn is happening here, and figure out, okay, well, if I want to do something that's reaching in the future, here's how I go about it differently. But part of the problem here, though, and I think no one's really talking about this, is that it's really just a problem of prolificacy. I mean, she needs an editor. She needs to take some time off. She just needs to like record a bunch of songs and sit around with them, and maybe listen to them in her car stereo 100 times until she realizes she shouldn't put that out on an album. Like if she had released this album 10 years later and it was like, oh, this was a collection of B-sides from this period of time, people would be raving about it. As a main tour de force artistic statement rather than an insight into her as an artist. It's a compelling insight into her as an artist. It is not a great standalone album, for a pop star of her caliber and what people expect of her.
Yeah. So, I mean, the other thing that I kept running back to is a couple weeks ago, I had our local art theater was playing like the 3-hour cut of James Cameron's The Abyss, which is like 40 minutes longer than the actual movie. And, I've always joked that like, James Cameron is a director. James Cameron director's cut, you better run. And at this point in time, anything that James Cameron does is a director's cut because he's so powerful. And, unlike someone like Tarantino or Paul Thomas Anderson, he's not working with that producer that he's worked with his entire career that's like, hey, stop, you're out of control. So you sort of go from this like discipline of a movie like Aliens or True Lies or Terminator 2 to, post Titanic James Cameron, where he can go back and, I mean, The Abyss is great. It would have been great without the aliens kind of thing. And I feel like Taylor Swift is in that mold. There's like nobody telling her no. And she's kind of too big to not fail at this point in so many ways.
Yeah, I call that the Stephen King problem.
Mm-hmm.
This is, I think that's exactly right. I just don't understand, what's going on. I mean, I get, partly it might be, she's worked with Jack Antonoff for a very long time now. She used to work with, differing producers and things like that. It might behoove her to switch things up. I mean, I don't know. I realize that the marketing of this stuff has gotten so niche that, people rely, the number of producers that you can sort of rely on anymore to get on the charts is like, you can practically count on like 2 hands or whatever. And certainly Jack Antonoff is one of those guys. And it's not to say that I think that Jack Antonoff is necessarily the problem. In fact, I quite liked the last album or whatever that he put out. He had that one really great evocative Springsteen song or whatever, I forget what it was called. She just needs to, like I said, find herself in different ways. And one way to do that, maybe it isn't necessarily spend an excess amount of time in Bali, but another way would be to just record with a whole bunch of different people. What? If you spend a month in a studio with a producer and it doesn't work, fine. Just throw the masters in a closet and move on to the next producer. Just keep working through your artistic things until you settle on something that you think is genuinely good. But then again, that also requires you to have some sort of people around you that are willing to step in and be like, hey, maybe we should rethink what we're doing right at this moment.
Yeah. So something I did want to mention, which is kind of the second part of this question, is, in the summer of last year, you wrote about Taylor Swift showing cultural decline. The silver lining of this album for me is that, as somebody that teaches film for my regular job, like I've never had a situation in my life where as many people know who Clara Bow is as they do right now. But even someone like Dylan Thomas, or, for lack of a better word, for lack of a better example, Patti Smith, I think a lot of Taylor's core audience is probably not reading Just Kids or probably not looking at Book of Days and may have never heard Horses before. So, I mean, do you think there is sort of this like curation that Taylor Swift is doing that might in fact stave off a little bit of that cultural decline?
Well, it is a welcome change. And like I said, to the extent that she's trying to grow artistically, like I applaud the impulse. And this is one way where I, very much applaud that impulse. If a lot of kids are looking up the Blue Nile right now on Spotify because of that record, I will be a very, very happy man. I mean, they're absolutely terrific, and deserve a lot more love than they previously got. The same thing with people reading Dylan Thomas or whatever. I don't know, maybe Clara Bow's got some films on YouTube or something like that. But yeah, I mean, one of the problems I would say is that I had with Taylor Swift or whatever was that I did think it was dumbed down and a lot of sort of illiterate stuff. And my problem in a lot of ways though was that it was dumbed down musically. like I said, I mean, it's the same damn chord changes over and over again, for instance. And I realize that, pop music limits are what they are, but, the actual sort of, harmonic sophistication of the music you were listening to, pop music you were listening to on the radio in the 80s from moment to moment, I mean, just radically different stuff from song to song to song in terms of like expanding the listener's ear and what they would consider, pop or catchy or whatever. And I don't feel like she's quite embraced that side of things yet. I mean, one big way is, I think, to get out of this artistic rut, I mean, I do think the music needs to match the lyrics in a lot of ways, and that, would be to embrace a much more sort of sophisticated musical approach. Now, obviously, she's been trying that a little bit with folklore and stuff like that. She has been searching out collaborators like Bon Iver and the National and things like that. I just don't see it quite sticking. I don't know whether it's because they're a commercial, because if she's got people around her that aren't doing a good job editing her, she's got a lot of people around her that are telling her that she's got, bills to pay or something. I don't know. She just can't seem to get away from these, pop instincts that may or may not be serving her well if she wants to grow as an artist.
So switching gears just a little bit, and we exchanged back and forth a little bit about this recent trend. Something that's been really shocking to me, just sort of talking, it's like I teach college again as my day job, but there's really, since last year, there's been this trend of these kind of established Gen X, early 2000s artists revisiting the 20th anniversary of a particular album. So, for example, last year I saw the Flaming Lips perform Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots in its entirety. They came to Nashville, they came to Knoxville, which is the show that I went to. This year, you saw last Death Cab for Cutie and the Postal Service playing Transatlanticism and the Postal Service's debut album, Give Up, in their entirety. Weezer's doing that with the Blue album. I know Modest Mouse, Cat Power, and the Pixies are playing a lot of their albums. And what's strange to me is, like, when I was a kid, some of these artists my parents were listening to, like, I had no idea who the hell they are. But what I found is it's very similar to what you see at the toy aisle in Walmart. Like, the same stuff that was in circulation in the 90s is what my students are listening to. I mean, they're listening to Weezer and the Flaming Lips. It almost seems like Bon Iver and the National are kind of the point where that's like the newest artists that a lot of these Gen Z and younger kids are listening to in some ways, with, the exception of an Olivia Rodrigo here or there. But those artists that were big for me when I was younger are still big for 20 somethings now. So what do you sort of think of is motivating this trend of like summer nostalgia? This, let's play our canonical album in its entirety and tour the nation.
So I'm a validly Gen X. I just turned 48. Nevermind came out when I was a freshman in high school. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest to boot. So like the height of grunge was my childhood. I was playing in bands at the time and all of that. And so like I'm a real big front row seat to a lot of this sort of, Gen X, alternative explosion. And I mean, there are some simple explanations for it, which is to say that like as Gen X gets older, they have more purchasing power and things like that. So obviously tours and stuff for bands that were big when they were younger are going to become more profitable. Some of that is, and I don't think younger people have any sense of this, which is to say that, for all of the hype around grunge, and, Nirvana and stuff like that, there were really only a handful of like quote unquote alternative bands that really had big mainstream success at the time. I mean, even bands that we think of as like canonical now, like the Pixies and the Cure, were not particularly popular. Like they were very much cult status, and believe me, they sold enough records to stay in business, but they were not songs you were hearing on the radio at all. And so their the Smiths is another band like that. Their reputation is, they were big enough to be known, but in terms of playing stadiums and stuff, no. So the reputation has really sort of like grown over time. And a lot of that has been, I think, well, the internet era in a lot of ways, has made it really easy to get exposed to this stuff. Whereas before you had to rely on radio and MTV and other tightly controlled distribution channels. And then some of that is just, frankly, that, I mean, I just think that, I'm sorry, a lot of the music that was made back in that era, like there was a palpable cultural excitement around it. There was a scene. It's just better and more durable music than a lot of the sort of indie music that's being cranked out today, or stuff that falls into similar genres. Which is not to say there aren't good records being put out, but even a lot of the good records being put out are very sort of like consciously sort of like backwards looking. I was playing. I just got My Bloody Valentine on vinyl for the first time, and I don't know if you have Loveless. For whatever reason, that was a record that was like impossible to find on vinyl forever. Anyway, I was playing it, and my 16-year-old girl, my 16-year-old daughter, walks into the room, and she goes, "This sounds like Mama," which is this up and coming like indie rock band who I like quite a bit. The reason why I like them quite a bit is because they sound totally like a band from the 90s. And I even remember seeing this YouTube video where they did one of those "We Go to Amoeba Records" video, and then they get to pick out whatever records they like. And I remember that in the video they pulled out a copy of Sugar's Copper Blue, and said, "Oh, our dad turned us onto this record." It's like totally looking backwards. I think partly because the Zoomer zeitgeist right now is not a good one. There's not a lot of like sort of like when I was growing up as a avowed Gen Xer, music was a big thing in terms of differentiating yourself from the previous generations. It was part of your like self-identity, both personally and as a generation. Like you liking cool bands is a way to differentiate yourself from uncool people. Your generation liking cool bands was a way to differentiate yourself from people that were still listening to Styx or whatever. And there isn't that sort of generational sense anymore. And I think people are kind of insecure about it. Probably because the internet has just broken our sense of time. Music doesn't cultural doesn't evolve because there aren't these tight distribution channels playing the new thing. You can listen to everything all at once, and so Zoomers are sort of nostalgic for a time they didn't experience, where there was a tight generational sort of identification, and the sort of Gen X starting the late 80s on is kind of the last closest period where people I think really like felt that through the 90s. But yeah, to bring this full circle, yeah, it's crazy. I was trying to think about this. I mean, the trend's been going back for a while. I think the first time I remember this was I went to go see the Pixies in 2007. This is the 20th anniversary of the Doolittle tour. They played that album in its entirety. In 2012, I saw Bob Mould do Copper Blue in its entirety. Bring this full circle, I guess. And then what's crazy for me at my age is like I saw the Death Cab for Cutie and Postal Service show I was at both of those original tours for the anniversary tour. I've seen like I figured out the other day I've seen like half a dozen shows in recent years. Like the Lemonheads did It's a Shame About Ray in its entirety for the 20th anniversary. I was at the original tour for that too. I've seen a half a dozen of these shows where they're playing the original album on some sort of anniversary tour. And again, as a valid Gen Xer, like I'm here for this. It's targeted right at me. And it's a good trend, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also really pervasive because I mean, outside of Taylor Swift or Greta Gerwig, Gen X is still the predominant culture maker. I mean, anything exciting that's coming out in film and novels, I mean, really every art form is all Gen X.
In the last week or two, Pearl Jam and James just both put out albums. They're about as good as anything both of those bands have ever done. I mean, there's a lot of these Gen Xers that are out there just still killing it. I don't know. I think it's just because they came from a place where they had a really solid musical ethos that has served them well in their career. I just don't think, I'm not quite sure younger generations have that same sense of ethos. The other thing about it is like I said, it was a very sort of self-contained generational thing. Being a band was part of an identity. It was a cultural thing. It was a thing that a lot of these musicians took seriously and took personally. Whereas I'm just not sure kids that are recording music on their laptops these days are part of this new, whatever the hell the industry is these days, have that same sort of sense of like artistic identity that exists for them as musicians outside of whatever the industry and distribution channels or whatever that exist today are.
Yeah. So before we go,
I did want to say one other thing, just real quick. One interesting thing about this album trend is that kids these days don't listen to albums. And it's interesting to see that being sort of embraced. And I think that also might be another thing that kids are nostalgic for. Like I think a lot of albums are weak because artists don't conceive of things in albums. They think of getting on Spotify playlists. And I think that makes a difference too. So people going back to really solid classic albums is a thing. Anyway,
No, go ahead. So, I mean, do you think that they're like not actually listening to the vinyl that they buy, or has that helped at all?
That's a really good question. As someone who's an avowed vinyl freak, I've got like 3,000 vinyl albums in the house. Um, I can't stress enough like how important the album was as like a format for me in terms of musical um, growth. I mean, the thing is you would buy these records frequently where you'd only like one or two songs. It would take repeated listens because you had spent 15 or $20 on an album or a CD, and you didn't want that money to go to waste. Before you actually got onto what the band was doing and gave them a chance, and all of a sudden you realize that song you didn't like at first pass really was a really interesting thing and something that you grew to love. And I worry that with the attention span of kids these days and Spotify playlists and all of that, the dopamine spikes and all of that, they're not getting the musical growth. And I think it speaks to the problem I was talking about with Taylor Swift earlier. People are writing songs in very specific ways to get on the radio because that's all that you get on the radio, get on the Spotify charts or whatever, because all that matters is having that one song people listen to rather than trying to make a drawn out artistic statement. And people like Taylor Swift, who focus on singles her entire career, don't know how to do like an expansive album that's about growth and maturity or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel that too because Sirius XM has this like Channel 13 Taylor channel to celebrate this new album, and it's not playing the Taylor Swift albums that were released through Big Machine. It's playing the Taylor's version of all of them, and I mean, I cannot listen to those records because like everything that I feel like made them authentic is gone, and that's kind of to me like the way millennial artists are working is they're like restyling themselves because they don't really know anything else out of this cultural bubble. So I mean, there's a lot to be said for your argument about cultural decline that you made last summer.
Yeah, it's a copy of a copy, and then and you can't fake sort of artistic sincerity or whatever. Bands that came out of the '80s and '90s underground. I mean, they sort of clawed their way out and have a very different perspective on making music. I think, and it shows.
So before we go, what are you listening to right now? Past, present, just some recommendations for our audience because you have such impeccable music taste and you know a lot more about music than I'm qualified about. So
that is a good question. I'm listening to a very cool band called the Loud Bangs, which is a kind of I don't know how to describe this. It's basically like a producer and a mysterious female vocalist. It's kind of like a shoegaze audio pastiche thing. It's like super compelling, and I really like them a lot. They were turned on to me by a rock critic friend of mine who's currently writing a biography of the Church that I can't wait for. I'm also listening to this great new jazz record by this like obscure, I think, Dutch jazz musician called Paul Willem, Pauliliem, which is just this like gorgeous jazz. Some of it's not quite jazz. It's some of these interesting female vocal compositions, but some of it's very overtly jazz, and it's just a really really gorgeous album. The new Everything Everything record, I don't know if you're familiar with them, is really really good. It's kind of like I don't know, like this really sort of frenetic but danceable like kitchen sink indie rock. You just kind of throw everything at the wall and somehow it all gels and it's really really good. There's a great band out of Nashville, believe it or not, called Los Colones. And they have a bunch of records that are good, but they put out a record a couple of years ago called The Wave that is just like, you want to talk about like, I don't know, millennials harkening back to, the 80s or whatever. Like this is like somehow uncannily good, recapturing like really sophisticated like 80s rock pop. I don't know, like, sort of, I don't know how to describe their influence to be like sort of like the 80s era, like Don Henley and, Dire Straits and things like that. And it's just really, really just impeccably good songwriting production. And I have no idea why these guys are so obscure because their stuff is so good.
yeah, I don't really think even in Nashville, that's like a band that I don't hear a lot about. So
Yeah, I don't know if they've gigged in a while, but yeah, they're from Nashville. I almost flew out to Nashville to see them a while back. It just didn't work out because that's how big a fan I am.
well, that's awesome. Well, we've got a pamphleteer playlist that we release every week, so we might do a special edition of that just as we move into the summer and everything. But Mark, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Love having you on the show to talk music. And hopefully we'll get to do it again, even if Taylor Swift doesn't come up. It'd be kind of nice to talk and not talk about Taylor Swift. So
Hey, my day job is writing about politics. So anytime I get a chance to talk about this stuff, I am, over the moon to do it. So anytime, you just let me know.
sounds good. You have a good weekend. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All right. So great conversation. I will say, I do like the album Tortured Poets Department. I've listened to it about 7 times this week, just sort of in preparation for the show today. It's an album I feel very conflicted about, but I think we talked a lot about those feelings and some of the criticisms of them in the segment. So check out the record. I would love to hear your thoughts about the record, either you're a Swiftie or not. So hopefully that'll be something that we can talk about in the coming weeks. Next, we're going to move to a movie that I hope everybody gets a chance to see. I don't think this one's going to be in theaters very long, but I had a chance to see the movie Sasquatch Sunset over the week. Actually, I saw it last week before my other show, but I've reviewed it, wrote a little essay on it in the Pamphleteer today, and it was a very surreal experience going to see this movie. And one of the reasons is that when I walked into my local art house theater to get my ticket, there were a bunch of people dressed up as Sasquatches, and it honestly kind of shook me to my core. It freaked me out. I didn't know what the hell was going on. There's an essay to be written about these Bigfoot Sasquatch people. Some of you may or may not know that May 4th, I think, there is a Bigfoot festival in Townsend, Tennessee. So I don't really know what the Sasquatch obsession we're seeing lately is all about. I mean, we have the soap brand Dr. Squatch. We have all kinds of strange stickers in various gift shops with Sasquatches on them. So I don't really understand it. But I was very excited about Sasquatch Sunset. One of the reasons is that I'm a major fan of the Zellner brothers who made the movie. They're a little bit under the radar directing duo that really hasn't got as much attention as someone like the Safeties who made Uncut Gems. But for a long time, they've been making these really beautiful, idiosyncratic movies. And if you had to think about an overarching theme for the Zellner brothers, it would be sort of anxieties about the landscape. I mean, they are American filmmakers, but they have a lot of the same sensibilities as Australian directors who are sort of obsessed with this idea of the landscape and their place in it. So, I mean, if you think about a movie like Mad Max Fury Road and how the landscape plays in, or you think about some of the horror movies that have come out about the outback, you sort of get what I'm saying here. But they've done this over and over again in different regions of the country. So one of their sort of signature films, Kamuko the Treasure Hunter, which came out 10 years ago, is about a woman from Japan who finds a videotape of the movie Fargo by the Coen brothers and ventures to Minnesota to try to uncover the treasure, the money that's in that movie. And it's about her and enduring the harsh landscape. They made a wonderful movie about 6 years ago called Damsel with Mia Wasikowska and Robert Pattinson. That's a Western and has a lot of the same sort of sensibilities as Sasquatch Sunset. So they're interesting because of the fact that they really do think about the American landscape and what that means in terms of our cultural identity. So what I love about Sasquatch Sunset is the fact that it's kind of a rejoinder to our current movie culture. We're in this world where everything is these convoluted multiverses. This world building is very important. These big sprawling narratives, character development, backstory, all of this stuff. I can describe this movie very simply. It's about 4 Sasquatches walking around the Pacific Northwest in the woods and dealing with the elements and dealing with danger. And that danger sometimes comes in the form of nature. That danger sometimes comes in the form of humans. But one of the great things about the movie is it doesn't really make a distinction between that. Is humanity just another natural threat to these mystical creatures? But what's really also striking about the film is that there's no dialogue. Instead of motion capture like you're going to see in a Planet of the Apes movie or like you're probably used to seeing in summer blockbusters, what the Zellner brothers have done here is take very recognizable actors like Jesse Eisenberg and Riley Keough and put them in costumes, put them in makeup, and have them interact with no dialogue. They just grunt throughout the entire thing. And what's outstanding is that they're professional actors, and they really make us feel that these Sasquatches are fully developed characters. Something else that I really appreciate about the movie is that there aren't any CGI moments. Whenever we see a cougar, when we see a porcupine, when we see a turtle, that's not just some lazy ass CGI that's thrown in there. They actually had animal wranglers on set. So this is a very analog film in so many ways. And it really does enrich the narrative and enrich the themes of the movie, because in so many ways, this is a movie about survival. The movie became sort of infamous when it premiered at Sundance because it has a lot of moments of what one would call gross out humor, which I think is kind of a bad term to describe what's happening in this movie. This isn't There's Something About Mary or American Pie. So, you have this kind of hilarious, amazing scene where the Sasquatches encounter a road and they immediately just shit on it. They immediately pee on it to mark their territory. And the audience that I saw this movie with just cracked up at that. And it's hilarious. It's funny, but the movie also asks us to really think about why we're laughing at something that's so rote, right? We're used to seeing these nature documentaries on Animal Planet or through National Geographic that sort of sanitize the world for us. We don't have copulation. We don't have these animals doing what they naturally do. Anybody that's got a dog or a cat knows that's just a natural part of life. So in a lot of ways, the movie's asking us to think about why we find this kind of stuff so funny. And is it bad to think it's funny? Does it cross a line to think it's funny? No, probably not. Like, it's just nature. And are we laughing about these natural elements because in some ways we're afraid of nature? We're afraid of what it brings. So in short, you're never going to see a movie like Sasquatch Sunset. It is absolutely unique, and that's something that's incredibly rare these days. So I would highly recommend that you all check that out. I know it's still playing at AMC Thoroughbred, and I believe it's also playing at the Regal Hollywood 27 here in Nashville. So if you get a chance, go see it. It's on half a screen this week. I'm sure when The Fall Guy comes out next week, it will be gone, which is a shame. So I would definitely make the time this weekend if you're interested in this film to go see it. So with that, we're going to move to our weekly film rundown. And for those of you who read my list of the 10 most anticipated films of the year, I'm very happy to report that one of those is coming out this year, and that is going to be my pick of the week. This is the new Zendaya movie, Challengers, by Luca Guadagnino, who is an Italian director who made the movie Suspiria. He made Bones and All with Timothée Chalamet about a year and a half ago. His movies are very lush. He makes some amazing films about relationships. So this movie is a sports film. It's a tennis drama where Zendaya plays the sort of rising star in the tennis world, and she gets into this sort of romantic relationship with these two guys. And the movie really traces their relationship, what happens as they get older. I've not had a chance to see it yet, but I am so excited because Guadagnino is one of my favorite working filmmakers today. In a time when Hollywood is really risk averse, he's been able to manage to make these sort of mainstream crowd pleasers that have a lot on their mind. So highly recommend checking out Challengers. I'm hoping to get out to it tonight. There are also a lot of other offerings this week, both some amazing restored classics and some other films that are also coming out. So for those of you that don't know, today is actually Alien Day. This is the 45th anniversary of the movie Alien. And to celebrate, a restored print of Alien is going to be playing just about every multiplex in the Nashville area and nationwide. So if you've never had a chance to see the movie Alien on the big screen, now would be a great time to do that. Absolutely. So I would highly recommend that you all check out Alien, get that big screen experience. Another movie that's coming out that I'm interested in seeing just because of the sheer originality factor is called Boy Kills World, and it stars Bill Skarsgård, and it's a post-apocalyptic vigilante movie. And it just kind of looks off the rails. The reviews have not been as great as I expected them to be, which kind of gives me hope. My favorite movies are always those films like Sasquatch Sunset that are in that 50 to 70% range. A lot of times when I said a movie that gets like a 96 and 99, I know that there's probably not as much there if it's not polarizing people. This movie just looks off the rails. You've got this like killer serial mascot. You've got all of this kind of in crazy fight scenes. H. John Benjamin from Home Movies and Bob's Burgers, I think, does the voice here because Bill Skarsgård's character is mute. And what happens is this like dynasty family goes and kills a bunch of people, including our main character's family, and he's rendered mute by this, and he essentially goes on a killing spree. So there's nothing better than like a late April revenge movie. You all might have seen the movie Sisu, the awesome Nazi action flick that came out about this time last year, and I'm hoping this is kind of this year's version of that. So I'm definitely going to be checking this one out at some point soon as well. The Belcourt also has a really rich slate of offerings this week as well. There's a film that's out, a documentary called Kim's Video. And for those of you that don't know, Kim's Video was this amazing video rental place in New York City that closed, I think, around 2009. And there's a weird story behind it because the entire collection somehow ended up maybe with the Italian mob. And this movie traces the history of Kim's Video and kind of the way that this collection found its way back to the States. The reviews have not been as positive as I would have thought they would have been, but I'm just interested in seeing this film because of the sheer oddity factor. And you see that there's some interviews with very famous filmmakers who were clients of this video store. David Wayne, he was responsible for State and Hello, My Name is Doris and Role Models and a lot of movies, kind of a master of comedy. So I'm really looking forward to seeing this at some point. What's kind of sucky is that it's only playing at the Belcourt until Sunday. So if you didn't get a chance to see it earlier in the week and you have a full dance card this weekend, you might not get a chance to see it in theaters. A little bit frustrating, but hey. Something else the Belcourt is showing this week that I'm incredibly excited about is the restored 4K print of Jean-Pierre Melville's Le Samurai, which is one of my favorite movies. If you haven't seen this movie, it is an absolute exercise in cool. So it follows a samurai or an assassin, a hitman, that's sort of steeped in the tradition of film noir with the cool trench coat, but he believes in the philosophy of the samurai. And he's walking around this kind of like mythic version of the French metropolis, and he's got a cop on his tail. So Jean-Pierre Melville is, I think, one of the more underrated filmmakers of the French New Wave, and he really wasn't technically part of the French New Wave, but he sort of gets sidelined when you hear names like Truffaut and Godard. But in so many ways, this is the type of movie that inspired somebody like Quentin Tarantino. So if you've never had a chance to see Le Samurai or a Jean-Pierre Melville film, the Belcourt has that opportunity for us this week. So very limited engagements with it, but it's definitely worth checking out. I'm also really giddy that the movie The Mummy from 1999 is celebrating its 25th anniversary by being widely released in theaters all across Nashville and the nation again. I'm sure most of you have seen the movie The Mummy. A lot of you saw it like I did in theaters in 1999. I'm kind of terrified that this movie is 25 years old. That makes me feel really old. But one thing about The Mummy that you might see, I had a chance to watch it during the pandemic because it technically is kind of a pandemic movie if you think about the plot. But, you know, this is the movie of like Hollywood in its heyday. And even the big budget blockbusters that are coming out now, they don't have the heart of this movie. They don't have this kind of sense of adventure that this particular film has. And so in some ways, it's a little bit mournful to go back and look at a movie like The Mummy and compare it to some of these big budget, soulless action flicks today. But I'm excited, hopefully get a chance to check out The Mummy before it leaves theaters. Because again, this is a movie that just begs to be seen on a big screen. So these are kind of the main events this week. I did want to mention one more. There's a film coming out called Who Could See Forever, A Portrait of Iron and Wine. And I should have probably brought this up with Mark in the previous segment, but Iron and Wine, amazing indie act. And the cool thing about this particular film is that Iron and Wine's, the mastermind behind Iron and Wine, I should say, Sam Beam, is actually going to be at the screening of this film during the Belcourt's Music City Monday this Monday. So I think the first 75 people who show up get an autographed movie poster. And the film is called Who Can See Forever, A Portrait of Iron and Wine. The director followed around the act for about 3 years, and sort of it started out as kind of a live performance documentary and then sort of moved into this kind of intimate portrait. So, you know, I'm going to be at the Death Cab for Cutie show and the Postal Service show that Mark mentioned in the previous segment that night, but I'm really looking forward to seeing this. I'm really sad also that I don't get the chance to go to Music City Mondays and see this week. But for those of you that do not have tickets or prior engagements, it might be something worth checking out. And those are my recommendations. A full list of all of the films opening up, including a weird B-movie horror take on Cinderella. That's going to be available in the pamphleteer today, along with my essay on Sasquatch Sunset. And that brings us to the end of our show. It's been kind of a whirlwind today, but we will be back next week when our special guest will be Ryan Dalton, the advisor to the Avery Trace Middle School Pickle Club, who is going to be hosting a pickle festival in Cookeville next weekend, and he's going to tell us all about these amazing kids. So whatever you do this weekend, give it some thought. This is me signing off. Have a good one.